Hello everyone, this is Lori doing a chapter lecture on chapter 6, Inequalities of Economics and Work. I'm not going to, as always, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the things that your book talks about, but there are some other things that I want to explore. I think in order to talk about inequities in economics, I want to talk about the economic systems, the three major economic systems, in order to look at how they contribute to or try to alleviate disparities and inequalities. Okay, so first, when we talk about economics, we're talking about, so the economy is a social institution that organizes society's production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. In other words, how and why does a particular system, how do they produce goods and services? How do they distribute them? And how do their citizens consume those goods and services? So depending on which system, which we'll talk about in a minute, depending on which system, this is all very different. Especially, the thing that's most different is the why. Why do particular societies produce, distribute, and consume goods in a particular way? Because each of the three economic systems that we're going to talk about, each of those has a different answer to this question. Okay, so we're going to start with the three economic systems, or at least the three main economic systems that exist globally. And again, the reason we're going to do that is so that we can look at how they contribute to inequalities. All right, so first, you're going to be familiar with this one, capitalism. And why are you familiar with capitalism? You can answer that in your heads. Okay, the reason we're most familiar with capitalism, it's because it is the economic system in which we live, the United States. Okay, now there are three primary characteristics of capitalism. First, and probably most definitive, is the private ownership of property. So in a capitalistic system, individuals can own almost anything. We can own land, which, of course, I'm not a drawer, but here's, we can own land. Here's some corn stalks. So we can own land to do whatever we want with. We can own our homes. We can own our cars. I can't draw. We can own the clothes we wear. We can own anything. We can even own our own private planes. I'm not even going to try to draw a plane, but we can own our own planes. Actually, doesn't Elon Musk own a rocket? We can own rockets. It looks like a bell, but it's supposed to be a rocket. Okay, we can own anything. That is a very distinguished characteristic of capitalism, private ownership of property. All right, another characteristic is that the ownership of private property and private whatever, we can own businesses, you can own land, and the reason for allowing that personal ownership of property, business, land, etc., is to create profit and wealth. Okay? That is the whole motive behind capitalism, is to create profit and wealth. So if you own a business, what's so great about owning a business in the United States? It can make you quite wealthy. Not every business makes you wealthy, but there are many, 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 many business owners who have created a great deal of profit and wealth for themselves. And that is the goal, not just of those businesses, but of capitalism. And not just business owners. My husband and I just about 2 years ago bought a new house. And in the last 2 years, that house has already increased in value by $100,000. So if we would sell that house today, we would profit by about $100,000. So even owning a home creates profit and wealth. So anything you own has the potential to create profit and wealth. And again, that is a huge value of the U.S. Profit and wealth is probably the biggest value. I would say people are very aware of the right to freedom. That's a huge value. Work, the ability to work, free speech. But among all of these things that we value so much in the U.S., do not discount the value that we as Americans place on profit and wealth. And if you don't believe me, I just want to share with you some things that sort of, to me, prove the way we value wealth. There is a corporate income tax. So if you are a business, a corporation, you have to pay an income tax on your income, just like individual citizens do. Corporations have to pay an income tax as well. Over the last 50 years, probably, corporate income tax has declined. In other words, the government has continued to decrease the amount of income tax that corporations have to pay. What does that mean? If they pay less taxes, increased wealth, right? So let's say you have, you make $100,000, a company, which they all make more than that. Let's say that there's a 30% income tax for corporations. You're going to lose $30,000 in taxes, so your net profit is going to be $70,000. Well, if the income tax goes down, the corporate income tax goes down to $10,000, then that just increased your profits by $20,000. Now you're only losing $10,000 instead of $30,000. So it increases your wealth. The capital gains tax is a tax on the sale of assets, including stocks and land. That has also declined over time. So the wealthy generally benefit more from capital gains than any other person, any regular employment income. That income tax, that corporate income tax, and the capital gains tax that have decreased also contributes to inequality, because now corporations are making more and more money, which means that the owners, and this I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but the owners of those companies are making more and more money. Right? So that is contributing to the fact that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So we value profit and wealth so much that we are continuing to give corporations breaks on their taxes so that they can continue to earn more and more profit. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's right or wrong. I am saying that that is contributing to inequality. That's been proven by economists, because the owners, if you own businesses, you own corporations, you own land, then you are benefiting from tax laws and increasing your profit, while those who are lower class are not benefiting from any tax laws. And there are no tax laws that benefit them as much as companies. Okay, and enough about personal profit and wealth. The third characteristic, check something here, of capitalism is the lack of government involvement or interference, if you want to look at it that way. So while the government has laws that impact private ownership, for the most part, the government doesn't limit the freedom or the freedom that somebody has to create wealth and profit. You can make much money as you want, and for the most part, unless it's illegal, you can do whatever you want with that money. Now, the government does own and operate a number of businesses, including lots of schools, most of the country's schools, parks, museums, the postal service, the military. They own a lot of companies. They also set some laws to regulate what companies can do in terms of safety and employment wages. So there's a minimum wage that's set by the government. There are safety standards that companies have to follow. But for the most part, the government does not interfere, as long as it's within the law, with private ownership. You can, again, own what you want and do what you want within the law with the things that you own. Okay, let's talk about socialism. Again, socialism is an economic system, and there are, of course, three characteristics or qualities of socialism, and most of them are in direct opposition to capitalism. Okay, so the second system that we're going to look at, first sort of characteristic is the collective ownership of goods, especially property and business. Government controls property and makes housing and other goods available to all, not just to the people with the most money. So remember, private ownership of property and land and business means that those folks who own that good, whether it's business or property, they can use that to build their own wealth. There's no limits to that. Socialism says that everything is owned for equitable distribution. Okay, so everyone gets access to housing, to health care, to education, equal access to those things. Whereas in a consumeristic society or a capitalistic society, access is purely based on income, right? So the wealthiest get the most access to things like health, the best access to things like healthcare and education. And in a socialistic society, socialism says that everybody has the same access to those services. Doesn't matter how much money you have or what your wealth is. Okay. Next is the opposite of capitalism, and that is that profit is not meant to be individual profit. Profit is meant to be used for the common good of all people. Okay, so similar to A. A says that the government controls most of the goods so that they can equally distribute it. And letter B says that any pursuit of profit or wealth is for the common good of all, not just for an individual's profit or wealth. You know, I told you about how in capitalistic societies, and in the U.S. in particular, our value really is profit and wealth. In a socialist society, the value is the common good and equal distribution. Socialist societies see capitalistic societies as very greedy, that it's just all about one person for themselves. And then the last characteristic, while in capitalistic societies the government has very little interference or involvement with private ownership, in a socialistic society, the government operates and controls most goods and services. So most everything is controlled by the government. So education, healthcare, healthcare is not privatized. The government owns healthcare, owns education, owns most business, owns transportation systems, etc. Everything is owned by the government so that they can make sure, in an ideal socialist society, so that they can make sure that there is a common, equitable distribution of all goods and services. So in a socialist society, there is no competition to gain wealth. There is only the goal of meeting everyone's basic needs in roughly the same equal manner. From a socialist point of view, the common capitalist practice of giving workers as little in wages and benefits as possible to boost the company's earnings is putting profits before people and is unjust. So when we talk about inequities, that last sentence is very important. In capitalistic societies, a capitalist practice is paying as little in wages as possible, in wages and benefits, as possible, so that what? Income, profit, is as large as possible. So why do companies then send their work overseas to developing countries? Why do major companies like Nike and Disney and dozens more, why do they send a lot of their work to developing countries? If you look at your clothing, just as one example, look at the tag on your shirt and see where your tag says your shirt was made. Most of our shirts, most of our clothing, you're going to find that they're made in other countries, and some often in developing countries, like Honduras or Guatemala or Malaysia or Indonesia. Why? Vietnam. Why? Because companies are trying to limit how much money they pay employees for wages. If they limit what they're paying out in wages, they are making more profit. So if they send their part of their operations to Indonesia, they can pay workers as little as $1 a day, maybe even less, maybe even 50 cents a day, to do the same work that would cost them, probably $10 to $15 an hour in the US. What does that mean? It means their profits are much greater than they would be if they had to pay a worker $10 an hour versus $1 a day. So in capitalistic societies, this is part of the inequity, is that businesses are looking to make as much money as possible at the expense of anyone who limits their ability to make a profit. Of anyone who limits their ability to make a profit, including their own employees. In socialist countries, in ideal situations, this to a socialist would be considered unjust, would be considered immoral, because in those societies it is unjust and immoral to put profit before people. But that is in fact what we as a capitalistic society, and any capitalistic society, has begun to do, is to make profit the greatest value even over people. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages, just very briefly. Hopefully you've already begun to see what some of the advantages and disadvantages are, but I want to just make a comment about that. So under socialism and capitalism, the personal freedom that each system gives its people varies greatly. Capitalism emphasizes the freedom to pursue self-interests and depends on the freedom of producers and consumers to interact with little interference. In other words, Target is going to produce goods and consumers are going to buy them. And the government doesn't interfere with that very much, except, as I said, with regard to safety and wages. Socialism, on the other hand, emphasizes freedom from basic want. So capitalism, freedom to pursue your self-interest, which is mostly wealth and income. Socialism, the freedom from basic want. So the goal of equality requires the government to regulate the economy. But that limits personal choices and opportunities for citizens. No system has yet been able to offer both political freedom and economic equality. So in the capitalist countries like the United States, our political system offers many personal freedoms, but they are not worth as much to a poor person as they are to a rich one, because the rich people can take more advantage of those freedoms. By contrast, a socialist country like Cuba has more economic equality, but people can't speak out as freely or travel freely inside or outside of the country. You can't use personal wealth necessarily to buy a plane ticket or to buy a car in order to travel where you need to go. So there are advantages and disadvantages, and you can make a case for how each system sets up inequalities in economics. Okay, just one more page of things that I want to talk about. What else in the economy sets up inequality? Okay, so a couple other things, other factors that cause inequality. So long-term forces play a role. So there are rewards that high high earners get, and there are and those rewards are not accessible to low and medium skilled jobs. So what happens then is that those who and I've alluded to this already, those who make more money have access to more opportunities, and the more opportunities you have, the more opportunities you have to create wealth, and it's just kind of a cycle. You have opportunities, you create wealth, that wealth gives you more opportunities, those opportunities gives you the ability to make more wealth, etc. The opposite is true for low and medium skilled workers. They don't receive the same access to opportunities, so they don't have the ability to make that same wealth. So if you are in a position where you can expect to make $15 an hour, there's little ability to move up or to create more wealth. The other thing that has created more of a divide is the idea of what have I got going on here? Globalization. I don't know why I can't. Here we go. Globalization. Globalization has actually also led to the increased wage and wealth disparities. Globalization has introduced tough competition for American workers because jobs were moved overseas, which I just talked about. And so what has that done for the economy? What it has done is allowed those companies to make more wealth, create more wealth. So the owners of those companies have been able to create more wealth. But it's also for those workers, so for your average worker whose job has moved overseas, it has either decreased their wages or completely eliminated jobs, generally speaking. Okay, so globalization is a factor. Having trouble here. The decline of unions is a factor. The average union member, so if you're a worker and you belong to a union, most union members earn about 25% more than an average worker. But unions over the last 50 years have declined. In 1983, about 20% of all workers were represented by unions. By 2020, that number had dropped to 6%. Now, this disproportionately affects Black workers because Black workers have historically been more likely to unionize. So without unions, who are a large institution who can advocate on behalf of workers, without that power that a union has, Black workers and low-wage workers have been unable to really capitalize on that 25% increase in income. Trade policies. So we have globalization, decrease of unions, trade policies have increased inequities. So there's, let's talk about President Trump. When he was elected in 2016, he had long been critical of U.S. trade deals. It was part of his campaign also that some countries had taken advantage of the United States to the detriment of U.S. workers. So President Trump really worked hard to reform trade deals with other countries. Many economists disputed the role of trade in manufacturing job losses. But the fact remains that, again, when we send work overseas, that does have a negative impact on low-wage earners who either their wages decrease again or their jobs are eliminated altogether. And then lastly, technology has been known to create inequities in the economy, automation in particular. So for low-wage earners, and that includes any low-wage earner, not necessarily people of color, but any low-wage earner has lost their jobs to automation. So what individual workers used to accomplish, now machines are accomplishing. So let's take the auto industry, for example. And I don't know the auto industry well, but I do know that the auto industry is used oftentimes to describe what has happened with regard to technology. So it used to be that auto workers that worked on an assembly line, so you have an assembly line, and workers actually literally assembled parts and cars. And they made good money. Auto workers were known to make really good wages. But what has happened is those assembly lines have been replaced by automated machines that now make the parts and put the cars together. And so that has eliminated jobs. Even though trade is not the sole reason that jobs have disappeared, it really is contributing to the decline of jobs, which means that low-wage earners, even though automakers made good salaries or good wages, they certainly weren't considered wealthy, and they certainly weren't considered owners of companies. So the loss, the introduction of automation has caused people, especially in assembly lines and that kind of work, to lose their jobs. So that increases that disparity between the rich and the poor. So the rich are making more and more money as a result of automation that can be more efficient, and the poor have gotten poorer because they have lost their jobs. The last thing is that I just want to mention that there have been proposals that have tried to make a difference with regard to economic disparity. One is to change the tax code. Remember, I said that companies don't pay a lot of income tax, which allows their profits to increase. So there has been a proposal that the tax code be overhauled so that higher income people are taxed at a higher rate than lower income people. People argue that shifting more money from the rich to the poor would reduce inequality and benefit society overall. But others say that higher taxes would stifle the economy. And so there hasn't been a lot of progress on the tax code because Democrats and Republicans can't agree on what that tax code should be. But just so you know, what's happened most recently is that in March of this year, for the first time, Biden called for a wealth tax, proposing a billionaire minimum income tax in his annual budget request. So he said he proposed that households worth more than 100 million. Now that doesn't mean 100 million in income. That means 100 million in wealth. So in other words, if you have $100 million worth of property, of income, of goods of any kind, so house, cars, property, and income, all equaling more than $100 million, you would have to pay a tax of at least 20% of your income, so that money then could be distributed, so the government would have more money and distribute that perhaps in ways that would benefit the working class or the poor. Critics have challenged that, of course, arguing that the tax would be bad for the economy and very difficult to implement. Biden has also proposed increasing the tax on inherited wealth, which is known as an estate tax, where if you were inheriting $100 million, that money would get taxed as well. People say that would dramatically reduce inequality. Others argue that it could lead to more tax evasion, which absolutely would happen. And Biden has also called for raising the corporate tax rate, which we've talked about, and capital gains tax, which we've also talked about. We know that President Biden has recently eliminated student loan debt. Hopefully I don't have to talk to you too much about that. Hopefully you've all heard about that and learned about that, since it probably impacts you directly. So that is an attempt, again, to decrease the gap between the rich and the poor, so that those who have a lot of money tied up in student loan debt can make some strides in accumulating wealth, since they aren't paying all of their income toward their student loan debt. I think that's it. There's so much more I could talk about, but those are primarily the things that I wanted to emphasize a lot, which is not in your textbook. All right, have a great week.